In 1400s Bohemia, the world needed a hero, and Henry answered the call. But even heroes need to eat, and for that, Henry turns to the true legend of the kitchen, Chef. Today, we're stepping into the world of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 to explore the food of medieval times, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, just like Henry might have eaten. So pull up a chair, grab your tankard, and let's dig in. Henry always starts his day with a hearty breakfast from Chef's Tavern. Henry, good morning. Come on in. I'm about to make some breakfast. Why don't you have a seat and I'll make you something.
Sounds great, Chef. What do you have in mind for breakfast today?
So what do you think? I make you one of your favorites. How about some amazing butter poached eggs and these dried fruit popovers I've been working on? Huh? You want those?
Sounds great, Chef.
Let me get you set up. Now to make these dried fruit popovers, I do have to start my day by making my pastry dough. I take 1.5 cups of milled flour that I picked up from our local farm and make a little divot into the flour so this way I can add a pinch of salt, a small amount of sugar to sweeten the dough, and then I combine these together on my cutting board to make sure all of the flour, salt, and sugar is fully mixed. Next, I take 1 farm fresh egg and add a bit of cold spring water to it. I then beat the egg to make sure it is nice and very smooth, so this way when I add it to my flour, it incorporates very well. I set aside this mixture for now so this way I can deal with our butter. I'm being very generous with the butter so this way you have a delicious and hearty breakfast. I'm taking my colder butter that was stored in the cellar and chopping this up into smaller cubes. This way I can add it to my flour. This step is very important when I'm making my popovers because it helps make the pastry nice and flaky. This does take a little bit of time, but you want to spend your time here so this way you don't have any giant chunks of butter that aren't going to melt properly. Once it starts looking like grains of sand and you can mix it up with your hands a little bit, it's ready to add all of the liquid. The egg and the water get added to the middle of the flour and I gently start mixing everything together. This dough should start to come together just by gently mixing it on the cutting board, but if it does not come together immediately, give it a bit more work and then add in a touch more cold spring water to help bring this dough together. This is why our chefs have to stay strong in the kitchen, so this way we can make this dough very easily and very quickly. After a few minutes, the dough should start to come together and look like, well, beautiful dough with bits of butter strewn throughout. This now gets portioned into the pastry that we need. I'm cutting up the dough into 6 equal pieces and this will give us quite a few popovers for the day. After cutting these into 6 equal pieces, I put these on a plate to rest for just a minute or two before I start rolling them out with a pinwheel. I'm adding just a bit of flour to my cutting board so the dough does not stick because of that butter. The butter does make everything stick really nicely, so to counteract that you will need a bit of fresh flour. Roll these pastry doughs out just until they are nice and thin. I want to make sure that my dough isn't too thick, otherwise it won't cook properly. After I've rolled it out to the thinness desired, I cut this and trim it so this way we get these beautiful rectangular shapes for our popovers. This is very important so this way the customers are really happy with what they're eating. Each ball of dough should give you 2 pieces for your popover, so this way each ball of dough makes 1 full popover. This is what my dough now looks like and I can start making my filling. The filling is also very easy to make but does take some time. This is a local fruit filling with toasted pine nuts. In this case, I'm using a bit of dried fruit that we dried on our drying rack along with some fresh fruit that we had picked fresh today. In this case, I'm using 1 whole pear that is absolutely delicious, and yes, I do treat myself to this fruit because we don't get it very often, and I'm dicing up the fruit into smaller pieces. This way, when I go to cook the fruit later, it does break down very easily and we don't have to wait too long for it to finish softening up. I do the same thing with the apple, making sure the core is fully removed so this way we don't have any seeds in our pastry. The apple itself is beautifully sweet and honestly we could just have this for a dessert, but instead I'm chopping up the apple and making sure it is about the same size as that pear. Once the apple is all chopped up, we can then take our raisins, our figs, our dates, and our dried prunes and begin to heat them up over this contraption. I don't want to talk about it, okay? We have this, it works. Now take a heavy bottomed pan like a cast iron and add a bit of olive oil to it. Next, I'm going to be toasting up some pine nuts. This has to be done separately so the pine nuts don't get too soggy. The pine nuts get toasted up with salt and black pepper, making sure that they are fully coated in that beautiful olive oil we added to the pan. Once these pine nuts get nice and toasty, which does not take too long, these can be removed, but be careful because the pine nuts can burn very easily if you are not careful. They go from golden brown and delicious to completely burnt and unusable very easily. Place the pine nuts into a separate container and set that to the side so this way we can begin the fruit. Take all of the dried fruit and place it in the same pan we just cooked the pine nuts in. This way we don't have to wash too many dishes. To this, I'm adding allspice, cinnamon, and nutmeg straight to my dried fruit. I'm also adding a bit of fresh ginger that we had as well, adding a pinch of salt, and a generous amount of delicious red wine. The red wine is going to soften up and cook all of this fruit. and give it an amazing flavor. I cook the dried fruit for 3 turns. This way the dried fruit cooked longer than the fresh fruit, which is very important because the dried fruit will take longer to soften up. After 3 turns, I add in all of the fresh fruit directly on top of the dried fruit. The goal is to make sure that everything is covered with that red wine so it cooks evenly. Now this will take some time, so meanwhile I will be prepping things behind me, keeping an eye on it as I can. After another 3 or 4 turns, our fruit starts to soften up, but I did cook this with a lid on so we wouldn't lose too much liquid as it cooked. This did take around 1 hour or however many turns that might be to soften up completely, and once it softened up, I use a masher to mash everything together and create our beautiful jam paste that we're going to use for our puff pastry. Make sure that everything is broken down. You do not want large chunks of fruit in that pastry. If you do have the large chunks of fruit, it has a chance of tearing or leaking out when we go to cook it. This is now what my fruit paste looks like. Really jammy and really beautiful. Now I can add the toasted pine nuts back into it. You do not want to cook the toasted pine nuts with all of the fruit because you do lose that toasted texture that we really want. After adding the pine nuts, cool it down completely on a plate and throw it in the cellar, or in this case it's just really cold in the garage, so I just kind of let it cool down in here. And make sure it's spread out so it does cool down properly. Our dried fruit filling is ready to go and it is absolutely delicious. This is what it looks like after it's cooled down completely. You can easily pick it up by your hand and go to town just as is, but we are going to stuff this into the pastry shells. Take a small amount of that filling, or a large amount if you're generous, and add it to the center of the pastry. Now press down on the edge of the pastry to make sure that it is completely sealed, but this isn't enough. We need to seal it further. Take a fork or another knife or apparatus and make sure you crimp down all of the edges completely. This is very important so it does not explode when we go to cook this later. I like to make sure that I crimp everything with the fork and then further press it down with my fingers until I get this beautiful popover pastry. I do the same thing for another 2 pastries to make sure I have enough for my customers who come in plus 1 for myself, and this is what my 3 pastries look like. Now take your fire creation mechanic that we're not going to really address in this at all and add a giant pot of oil to it. To measure the heat for my pastries to deep fry, I take 1 sage leaf and add it to my pot. Once the sage leaf starts to bubble and fry, that is when I know that my oil is hot enough to deep fry my pastries. I want to be very careful when placing these into the oil because I do not want them to sink to the bottom immediately. I make sure that the pastry does not sit on the bottom by stirring it back and forth very gently and not being too aggressive with it because that pastry can open if we're not careful. Because I'm a professional, I'm cooking 2 of the pastries at one time, but if you're not comfortable cooking multiple, just cook 1 at a time and you will be fine. After a minute or 2 of stirring and making sure it's not stuck to the bottom, I like to flip my pastry once one side has gotten nice and golden brown. This is what my pastry looks like when it's completely done cooking. A nice deep brown color. This is when I know that my pastry is done cooking. I did this for my remaining pastries and I had 3 beautiful fruit-filled pastries for breakfast, but we're not done yet. Because I like to go above and beyond for Henry, I'm also making some herb and butter poached eggs. In that same cast iron that I've cleaned out 700 times now, I'm adding in a large amount of butter, followed by some fresh thyme and sage from the apothecary. Once the butter is nice and hot, I'm cracking 2 farm fresh eggs directly on top of that hot butter, watching one of the yolks sadly break into that butter. I'm seasoning this with salt and black pepper, and then tilting my pan to gather up all of that beautiful herb butter and placing it right on top of the yolks. This is called basting, and it allows the butter to cook the top of the eggs and give it a beautiful, rich flavor that can only be had from doing it this way. The eggs should take no time to cook, and I'm finally ready to serve breakfast. The 2 eggs go on a plate very simply with a ton more of that butter, followed by 1 pastry. And this is breakfast: 2 butter poached eggs and a fruit pastry. It's a simple breakfast, Henry, but it's going to keep you going all day, especially because I know what you're doing later in the afternoon.
Wow, Chef, you've really outdone yourself. I don't know how you make these every single morning for the entire village of 7,000 people. This pastry looks amazing. It's a little dark, which is fantastic, and when I crack it open, look at the beautiful flaky pastry underneath, as well as it absolutely stuffed with all of that fruit. I can't wait to take a bite out of this. It looks fantastic. Nom 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 nom. Oh, I cannot express to you the savory, sweet nature of this. It's creamy, it's savory, it's tart, it's spicy, it has everything I want in a breakfast, and it falls apart when you eat it. This is the perfect pastry. Yum, 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 yum. But I need to try the butter poached eggs. I haven't had these in a while, and I'm so excited to eat them. This looks so fantastic. Yum, 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 yum. Chef, these are the best eggs you've ever made, but I'm combining the two together to get everything in one bite. Yum, 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 yum. Chef, I don't know how you do this. I love this so much that I feel so compelled to go on an adventure, and I'm going to do that right now. I cannot hold back any longer. I will be back for lunch, but this is going to be the most epic day ever.
This video is sponsored by Warhorse Studios and their brand new game Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Follow and create your own story of Henry of Skalitz from 1400s Bohemia. Take part in epic night battles, woo a fair maiden, become part of the story and part of history. But make sure you become the best possible Henry you can be, and when you're ready, you can enjoy the spoils of war. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is available right now. Use my link down below to purchase on your favorite platform.
Chef, I've made a mistake. They kicked me out of the tavern and I am quite hungry. Do you have any stew left?
Yeah, Henry, it's on the table, but I'm a bit busy, so you remember how to make this, don't you? Well, I'll give you a little refresher, Henry, because this stew is one of your favorites and I want to make sure you know how to make it. I take one whole parsnip that I'm peeling back with my knife, just so this way it tastes a little more clean. Then you chop up that parsnip into smaller bite-sized pieces, but remember not to cut them up too small, otherwise they will disintegrate in that soup. I do the same thing with a couple of carrots to provide sweetness to the overall stew and make sure that these are cut up about the same size as the parsnip was. The overall goal with the stew is to have pieces that are all just about the same size, so this way they fit on a spoon really nicely. I'm also adding in one whole potato with the skin on because the skin is super nutritious. The next part is one whole onion that I'm giving a rough chop to. We don't have to be fancy here because we're just making a quick stew that's going to sit around all day. After all of those vegetables are nice and chopped up, I can move them to the side and work with the lamb. I've already cut the lamb into smaller bite-sized chunks, and this lamb smells amazing. It's super fresh and ready to eat. I season the lamb with a generous amount of salt. Yes, we do need a good amount of salt here, and as well as a good helping of black pepper to add a bit of flavor to the lamb. Next, I add one whole measure, or 1 cup, of flour directly on top of the lamb. This is going to help give the lamb a beautiful coating and help thicken the stew later once it starts cooking. But why is it when I make soup this happens?
Settle down, you two. Not in this tavern. Not in this tavern.
I swear, sometimes it's like looking after children, but I'm going to finish explaining this stew. After I've combined all of the flour with the lamb, I can grab my cooking apparatus that I am going to again not mention as to how I got, and take a heavy bottomed pan and add a ton of butter to the bottom. Once the butter is nice and melted, I'm adding in all of that lamb along with the flour and start cooking this down until the lamb gets a little golden brown. This takes a few minutes to do, but it's a very important step because this part helps thicken the lamb later. Once the lamb is nice and golden brown, I'm adding in one whole clove of chopped garlic to give it a ton of flavor. After that, I'm throwing in all of the vegetables that I previously chopped directly on top of the lamb. I'm making sure that I stir this quite constantly so nothing burns at the bottom. Then I'm seasoning it with some dried herbs. I'm adding fennel, caraway, thyme, and some dried parsley directly on top of the stew to season it really nicely. Next, I'm adding in quite a bit more salt because we added all of those vegetables. This gets a nice heavy stir and making sure that all of those vegetables and all of the lamb are now incorporated in that soup. The last thing is to add my homemade beef broth, making sure that all of the soup is fully covered. After giving the soup a few stirs to make sure everything is fully incorporated, I throw a lid on it and it is ready to cook.
This has to cook for a few hours. I don't want to see anything out of you two.
While this is simmering for a few hours over that very low heat, I get a little more prep work done to make sure I can get dinner ready on time as well. After 1.5 to 2 hours of a low simmer, the stew should be beautiful and done. All of the vegetables and lamb should be incredibly tender. After a few more gentle stirs, this stew should be ready to serve, but I do need to serve it with one more thing that I picked up earlier. I grabbed a beautiful piece of sourdough bread from my local bakery, making sure that I cut off the very end of it because that's always for me. It is the most delicious part and no, you can have it. And then cut off a giant chunk to serve with the lamb stew. The fresh baked sourdough goes so well with the lamb stew. It helps absorb a ton of the flavors and it's a nice little piece to sop up any additional liquid. This is the lamb stew that I always serve for lunch and I can't seem to make enough of it. Henry, I know this is one of your favorites, so I'm going to let you dig in and tell me what you think of my lamb stew. But for now, I'm going to get back to prepping for dinner because I have to get this pork ready to serve you once you're back from your shenanigans.
Ah, chef, you honestly make the best lamb stew. That potato was so insanely tender, it just kind of fell apart in my mouth when I started chewing. And this lamb, look at this lamb. It is so beautiful, golden brown and tender. Nom 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 nom. Oh, it's hot, hot. The spices you use are perfect in this stew, and they complement the lamb so well. And look at his bread, sopping up all of that beautiful stew juice. Nom 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 nom. I can't explain to you how amazing this sourdough is with this stew, but it's probably the best lamb stew I've ever had. Well, chef, thank you for the quick bite to eat, but you know what time it is. It is time for adventure. I will be back for that dinner, but for now, I need to work up an appetite. Chef, my adventures are done for the day. I am ready for dinner, and I am quite hungry.
Henry, come on in. You're late tonight. What were you doing out there?
Well,
You know what? I don't want to know, but I have something special for you for tonight. I picked up some local pork from our favorite farmer, Ted.
Ted truly is the best pig farmer for giving us this beautiful cut of pork. Now this dish is very simple to make because it's the end of the night and we just want to get drunk. I take 2 beautiful pork fillets and I season them very heavily with salt and black pepper. That's all we need for this recipe. Now I take my cooking apparatus that creates fire out of nothing, and no, I still won't tell you how to get this, and I'm cooking these in a nice cast iron pan with some olive oil. I'm placing those 2 pork cutlets directly into the pan once the pan is nice and hot. This is going to sear the pork really nicely on each side. Once we have a little bit of color on one side, we just give it a flip and we continue cooking it on that second side. What I also like to do that my customers don't know about but that I'm telling you is I also like to sear the edges of the pork. This helps render down the fat, so this way it's easier to eat and it becomes nice and tender. If you skip this step, you might have rubbery edges of your pork and no one really wants that. Once all of the edges are nice and seared, the pork should be ready to go. It just needs a couple of minutes to rest before we cut it, and this is what my pork looks like right now. The way I like to let my pork rest is with a good amount of butter. I melt down the butter directly on top of the pork, kind of coating it in all of that buttery goodness. This will give the pork a good buttery flavor, and everyone loves that. Now there's only 2 more steps to finish off this pork. I'm removing the pork out of the pan and I'm slicing it into fairly thick slices. The reason for this is because I'm putting this back into the pan with all of that excess butter that we had melted. Once it's back in the pan, I add in just a bit of fresh thyme because fresh herbs are so much better, and I'm heating this up just a little bit to activate all of the butter and all of the herb. This is going to start coating each piece of that pork in all of that herb butter and add just a bit of color to each slice of pork. This starts to smell absolutely amazing. Once each side of the pork is covered up in that beautiful herb butter, this pork is ready to plate up. Look at how absolutely amazing this pork looks. It's juicy, it's glistening, it's golden, it's fatty, it's buttery. I like to serve up a ton of pork to my guests and make sure I do try every piece to make sure it's not poisoned.
You're gonna love this move, Henry. I know how much you love those popovers from breakfast, so this is for you.
I actually saved some of the whole pieces of fruit from the breakfast popovers before I had mashed them. Because I knew I was making this for dinner, this topping goes so well on top of the pork. A braised fruit with pork is absolutely amazing and everyone should try this. The seasonings complement the pork perfectly, and paired with a nice tart tangy sauerkraut, you can't go wrong. Henry, I hope you're still hungry because this is for you, buddy.
Dinner is served.
Chef, you have been feeding me all day long, and I think you have outdone yourself with this last dish for dinner. Nom 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 nom. Wow, just that pork with those braised fruits go so well together. I can't explain. Nom 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 nom. How amazing that combination actually is. But what if I do the pork, the fruit, and the sauerkraut at the same time? Nom 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 nom. It's tart, savory, sweet, juicy, succulent, buttery, spiced really well. Chef, you've outdone yourself, and I'm taking this to go because I have somewhere to be.
Henry, our hero Henry, the fellow who helps his fellow man.
God, what's with that awful singing, Henry? Kids these days. I'm gonna leave all of my recipes for medieval food from Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 in the area below the tavern, also known as the description. So that way you can make everything at home. If you want to see me try Kratos' diet from God of War, click or tap right over here. My name is Chef PK, and remember, keep playing with your food.